Hello friends, tonight we're going to take a look at the Terravantium P38-AT. This is a fantastic little manual folding knife. If you're not familiar with Terravantium, it might be easy to look at this knife and write it off as another small, fairly ordinary folding pocket knife. And in terms of minute-to-minute functionality, that's what it is. It's a little knife that sits in your pocket until you need it, and you cut shit with it. For people who mostly use knives to cut open the mail and packages they receive from Amazon, that's all this will be, and there are far cheaper options on the market for that. But if you use a knife for work, this one will be very interesting to you. If you use your knives constantly throughout the day, sweating on them, using them for all kinds of weird shit that you probably shouldn't use a knife for anyway, you need to look at one of these, or at least something that's made from this blade material. However, some of you are already rolling your eyes at both the knife and at the enthusiasm that I have for it. You loathe that I have enjoyed such a ludicrous, gimmicky knife so much. Surely the gun penguin has sold out, showering praise on this knife. But why? Why are these people, why are they rolling their eyes? It's just a knife, right? Well, you see, this knife, or its blade at least, is made of Terravantium, a dendritic cobalt, and it's very easy to write both the knife and the material off as a gimmick, or at the very least a fad with overstated cutting abilities. That's what I also assumed, and that's why it took me a few months of testing to make this video. I had to do quite a bit of work to confirm that Terravantium behaves as advertised, and it does. Terrain365 was very upfront with me about what it would do, and they were right. I was very much surprised by the performance of this knife, and I frankly love it. I also love this blade material, but we need to talk about why I love it so much, as it may not be right for you. This material is not right for everyone in all circumstances. And also, some disclosures. This knife was sent to me for review. I was not paid for this video. I was not told what to say. I told them that I intended to extensively test the knife and that I would speak honestly about it when I was done. So I'm going to tell you what this knife does well, who it's for, and what it doesn't do so well. Let's dive into the material first, and then we'll discuss the knife itself. Terravantium. This blade is not made of steel. I know, that's crazy, right? And some of you are likely suspicious of this strange new space material. I certainly was, but I'd done enough reading in advance to know that I was very interested in this material, and even if I'd not been sent this knife, I was planning to buy a Terrain365 anyway to test on the channel. This blade is made of a material Terrain365 calls Terravantium. Terravantium is a trade name for their specific dendritic cobalt alloy. Dendritic cobalt works differently than steel. It's a bunch of tiny carbide crystals floating in a cobalt matrix. Carbides are very hard and the cobalt is softer. As you sharpen the blade and create an edge, the cobalt is cut away, leaving tiny exposed carbide crystals. These carbide bits are very sharp, and the edge functions more like a tiny saw or a blade with, teeny micro serrations than a traditional edge. The carbide crystals cut for a very long time, but we'll discuss that more when we talk about the knife's performance. Terravantium is non-ferrous, non-magnetic, and highly corrosion resistant. And we'll talk about what all that means in the real world a bit later and whether or not that will matter for you. All right. So, the P38, the knife itself. As for the P38, it's a tiny manual folder, and I really love it. This design is fantastic. The blade is 2.75 inches long, so it's quite small. The overall length of the knife is 7.5 inches, and it weighs 3.8 ounces. Let's compare it to some other knives that we're familiar with. The Microtech SOCOM. Let's see where we can all see these in frame. So the SOCOM is way bigger. What about just a standard Ultratech? Yeah, the Ultratech is also much bigger than the P38. The knife is a liner lock, and the blade opens on ceramic bearings. They are super smooth. Yeah, that's really slick. Looking at the knife, there are no steel components that I can find. The blade is made of Terravantium, the handle is titanium with carbon fiber scales. Everything here is rust-proof. Even the pocket clip is titanium. The thumb studs have glow-in-the-dark inserts that charge in the light, and the visual details are just generally beautiful, very clean and well done. The blade is this kind of a two-tone matte and shiny finish. Guess you'd call the blade a kind of spear point, I guess, and the aesthetics are very nice. Also, the jimping, very clean on top with the edges rounded over. Really, all the edges are rounded. There's Nothing to catch on your clothes or anything else. All the edges are chamfered. It just feels fantastic. Knife performance. The performance of the Terravantium is important, but I'm afraid discussing it first will take the spotlight off of how well this knife design performed, because those are really two different things. So first, let's talk about what I did with this knife. I work as a luthier. I repair and occasionally make stringed instruments, primarily guitars and basses. I spend much of my life in my workshop, and tools are very important to me. Knives are part of that tool set. Every day I carry two knives with me, a defensive knife and a work knife. The defensive knife is never used because it needs to be very sharp. This is often an OTF, typically a Microtech. And if not that, it's usually a tiny attention to detail fixed blade that I adore, the Lil Pecker. By the way, the attention to detail Lil Pecker and all of Doug's defensive fixed blades are amazing, highly recommended. This thing may not look it, but it is really small and super handy. This is definitely my favorite fixed blade to carry on a daily basis. I love it. But the work knives get rotated out because I dull them so fast. And I try everything. Fixed blades, folders, big, small, they all have their place. My favorite fixed blade for work, if I can get it in frame, I just say that every time I put a new knife on the table, don't I? Like I clearly don't fucking plan ahead for this shit. It's the attention to detail Tanto. This is such a good fixed blade. It's so good. That's still my favorite fixed blade for day-to-day stuff. Nothing's changed there. And every kind of work knife kind of has its place, right? I use work knives for the usual stuff like opening mail and breaking down cardboard boxes, but in a workshop, knives are also called upon to do some weird shit that you really didn't know you need them to do until you're there and you need it. And anybody who's worked in that sort of environment is going to tell you that you often end up using your knife improperly as a different tool because you're lazy. The real tool that you need, it's all the way over there, like way over there, like 10, 15 feet maybe. But this knife, well, it's right here in your pocket. And guess what? You can open it with one hand. So knives become all sorts of other things. Spatulas, hammers, screwdrivers, chisels, they do it all. And so I dull them fast. And it's also easy to break knives in that context or corrode them or, whatever else. I need something robust. So let's come back to this thing. Let's talk about that attention to detail fixed blade and why it works so well. I mentioned, last year or maybe the year before that I was using the shit out of this Tanto. Nothing's changed there. This is the most useful fixed blade I've ever encountered. It's amazing. If you have the money, you definitely want one. This is one of those knives that will happily do all kinds of non-knife stuff that would break any other knife. It's just killer. At the cheaper end of the spectrum, we have the SE3. This one's made of S35VN. This is an amazing, amazing work knife, but this one you have to be careful because it's a little bit thinner. It's not going to be as good at some of the crazy tasks, the shit that a knife shouldn't be doing anyway. It'll snap, but again, you're not supposed to be using it for that. However, I like the attention to detail because it doesn't care. Look how thick that thing is. So just, choose the right knife for the right purpose, but the SE3, fantastic choice. Love this knife. For folders up to this point, I've always used the Microtech SOCOM, which you saw earlier. A fantastic choice. It's outstanding. It's robust. What more can I say? And for OTFs, I've always chosen the humble Ultratech single edge. Can't go wrong there. It's probably not in frame. Nothing ever is on this channel. The P38 has stayed in my pocket for reasons past the Terravantium. So the Terravantium made the knife difficult to review because I needed more time with it. But because of how useful the little knife is, it would have stayed in my pocket regardless, review or no. When you first pick it up, you notice how small it is. Next to the SOCOM, look at that thing. The SOCOM is so massive. The P38 is so cute. But I've learned over the last year that we rarely need as much blade as we think we do. Almost never, actually. Carrying the knife in my pocket, I came to love how small it is. This is certainly not the lightest knife in this size class or even close to it, but the weight is fine. The knife is chunky to fill out the hand, and that keeps it from being as light as it could be. It filling out your hand, it also makes it easier for you to use it when you actually need to do some work with it. So I don't much mind that. Weight matters more to me in the context of a defensive knife. I want those to be light because that's something that you aren't using outside of a very remote possibility and is really just kind of along for the ride, taking up space. This knife is there to actually be used, and therefore its usefulness matters more than an extra ounce or two, to me anyway. Thanks to the clip, it carries pretty deep in the pocket, and it's easy to get it out when you need it. The thumb studs are very large and easy to find when you need to open the knife, but they're still mostly flush with the scales. They stick out a little bit, but not too much. I love all the little details here. Speaking of the thumb studs, I've dropped this knife several times, hard on tile, and I think it hit concrete at some point. Once it fell out of my pocket and I heard this crack and I figured I'd broken the knife. Well, it turns out that the thumb stud actually broke what it hit instead. The thumb studs, after all the impacts, have developed the tiniest bit of wiggle, and that's due to my poor treatment, and I'm sure Terrain 365 can tighten that back up. I'm very impressed that I haven't done more damage. I have been rough to this knife, and it's stood up to all of it. Very impressed. So, I mentioned the thumb studs have these little glow-in-the-dark inserts that you can charge with a flashlight or whatever light source you have nearby. This works the same way the HK sights do with the glowing sight paint. That might be useful outdoors, but I haven't used the feature. It's a cool touch, but I don't know how useful that will be to you or to anybody, really. The action is very slick. It's on those ceramic bearings like we talked about. Yeah, it's really slick. Like greased up ice or something. Is that slick? Yeah, greasy ice. That sounds pretty slick to me. But whatever awful simile you want to use, this is very smooth. Look at that. And even more impressive, I haven't added any oil. It's just smoothed out a little bit with use, but it was incredible from day one. The liner lock gives me some trouble though. This may be intentional, but I don't think it is. I think it's because of the way Terravantium behaves. If I open the knife with some force in a hurry, the liner sort of bites into the cut flat on the blade where it's supposed to stop the blade. And I have to push the liner back in with some force when that happens. You hear that snap? A lot of effort can be required depending on how hard I open the knife. And most of the time, you're not going to be opening it that hard, but it's still kind of one of those weird things. And I do think it's because of how the liner is biting into the Terravantium. That's one of those things that you should be aware of it, but who cares? It's fine. It's a non-problem. If I open it gently, or at least reasonably, it doesn't stick at all. If I behave like a person and I don't open the knife like a wild animal, there's no issue whatsoever. The problem is I do behave like a wild animal. And while this is worth mentioning, again, it's not a problem at all. You just push with a little more force. As a user, I don't care that this happens. And you could also argue that this makes the knife very difficult to accidentally close, though that's not really a problem with liner locks anyway, is it? That's why initially I wondered if this might be intentional before I worked with the knife more. When dealing with something like Terravantium, it's inevitable that some things are going to be different. It's going to behave differently in a liner lock than steel. That's just the way it is. Wow, now the cicadas have started up. So this action is super smooth, but if for any reason it isn't, they give you some awesome oil. I tried it out just to give it a whirl. It's fantastic oil, but I never got to a point where I needed it. I just tried it because I'm reviewing the knife and it was in the case. Once the knife is open in your hand, it feels so good. See how it fills my palm? It immediately becomes apparent why this knife is a bit thick. It's for comfort. If it were any thinner, you'd lose some of this awesome feel. This is about as small as a knife can be and still be useful for almost anything you ask it to do. That's why this is such a good work knife. That curve in the handle is subtle and your fingers are guided exactly where they need to go. Your hand is very grateful for all the work that was done to make every corner smooth. Every edge is chamfered and nothing feels sharp, even after using this knife quite a bit in one day. You don't get hot spots or weird blisters. The carbon fiber scales are perfectly flush with the titanium, and I love that. Looking at the knife, you'd imagine that it would feel slick because there isn't a ton of texturing. I worried that would be the case, but it hasn't bothered me at all, even with sweaty hands. Because of the shape, you can kind of lock in around the handle quite well, and it's not going to slide around. But texturing has been put where you need it. The jimping is excellent. It's deep enough to grip your thumb, and the edges and sides are round to keep them comfortable to the touch. All right, so how does all this come together? What's it like to actually cut shit with this knife? It feels great. What more can I say? It's a killer knife. The blade's grind and edge geometry makes it plenty robust to cut almost anything, but it's also delicate enough to do, delicate tasks. There's not much of a tip, but there's plenty to use, and that keeps it from being so gracile that you can snap it off easily. Also, how often do you really need some super sharp tip on a work knife? You really don't. The tip on mine is presently blunted from a trip the knife took off my workbench onto the floor. Surprisingly, there's enough edge here to cut bigger stuff than you would think, and the grip and jimping give you a lot of control. This is just a comfortable knife. I don't know, what more can I say? Whatever you need this thing to do, it's going to do it. And it also looks pretty damn good, I think. But it's a lot more versatile than you would imagine, and it's robust. There should be far more damage than there is on this knife, considering all the things that I've done to it and how much it's been used. As I've mentioned, it fell into hard surfaces several times, and it just really doesn't seem to care that much. I'm impressed. Terravantium performance. So I knew the knife was going to be great after a day or two. You can kind of feel when you get a new knife if you're going to like it or not. You hold it in your hand, you cut some things, and you go, oh yeah, no, that's good. But the Terravantium, that was the unknown. That's what I was really testing here, and that's why it took me months to get this done. Terrain 365 produces awesome, useful designs. We know this. We know the knives are good. But Terravantium, I didn't know what to expect. The folks who like it online really like it, and the folks who hate it really hate it. But I noticed that a lot of the folks who hate it, they hadn't actually used dendritic cobalt for any substantial length of time. That made me reluctant to film this review without a ton of experience. Usually I carry a knife for a month or so, and I feel like I have a good handle on it, and then I can write and film a decently well-informed review. But with Terravantium, after the first week, it was clear that this wasn't going to be simple. Not because the material didn't test well, quite the opposite. It would have been much easier if it had just been shitty and I dulled it immediately, case closed. So first, let's talk about what Terrain 365 told me to prep me for the review. I was very impressed with this part of the process. They didn't tell me that this is a wonder material ready to replace steel and take over the knife world, ushering in a new glorious age of space alloys. That's not what they said. Instead, they explained to me how it works, just as I explained it to you earlier in the video. They told me the limitations of the material, as well as where it excels. Most importantly, they told me what kind of edge to expect. They said it starts out very sharp and then quickly moves to a medium, toothy working edge where it stays for a very long time. That's interesting to me. If you've spent a lot of time with knives, you know what I mean by a working edge. With a working edge, the knife is not razor sharp. It doesn't shave your hairs so cleanly that you pass the blade over your arms and the hairs are removed as if by lasers or fucking space magic. Instead, a working edge is a pretty sharp edge that will cut most anything you need, but you aren't going to be able to shave your face or cut tissue paper or, whatever. And really, when the hell are you going to use a work knife for any of that shit anyway? You're not. I keep my defensive knives that sharp where they sit completely unused in my pocket. But a work knife just needs that working edge. That's all. That's what I think of as medium sharp. So, knowing all that stuff, I started testing it. When the knife first arrived, it was very sharp. Not M390 Microtech just in from the factory sharp, but very sharp. It would shave and cut very thin paper. But it wasn't ludicrously sharp. It's not monomolecular edge sharp, ready to cut a hole in the space-time continuum, but it was still great. However, it dulled from that point very quickly, within a few uses, a few cuts, I mean. I figured that was it. This material was overrated, and I assumed that it would continue to dull at the same rate like steel. I was wrong. After dulling a bit, just as Terrain 365 told me, it hit that working edge, and there it stayed for a very long time, far longer than I had assumed was possible from this material. Steel certainly won't do that, even the so-called super steels that I'm so fond of. They don't just dull to a point and then hang out there, for months. But I noticed that dendritic cobalt cuts differently, not just longer. After some experience, I found that I was able to feel that toothy edge, like I was using a little tiny pocket saw. With that working edge, I could cut things using a normal technique just fine and could get about the results that I would with a steel blade that is medium sharp. But if I cut using a slight sawing motion, suddenly the knife would slide right through anything, as though it were much sharper. This was fascinating to me, and it was very noticeable with cardboard. After a few weeks of use cutting normally, I would feel the blade was too dull to be useful, and then I would apply a bit of a sawing motion and the blade would start cutting again. Even right now, when the blade is so dull that I couldn't cut myself with it, if I wanted to, I can still use that sawing motion to cut through some small things if I needed to. That's wild. And after a month or so, just as quickly as it got to the working edge, it went from that edge to totally dull in different spots based on how much I'd used those particular places. Past the cutting performance, I live in South Carolina. I also frequently visit the coast of our lovely state. It is very hot and humid there, and I sweat constantly in my workshop. It's hot today in this room, very hot, so I'm sweating today. If a steel is going to corrode, it's going to corrode in my hands. And then I take knives to the coast, where they are used near the beach, or perhaps on boats, adding salt water to the mix of humidity and my corrosive workshop sweat. Because of this, I have to check my knives often to make sure I'm not corroding the steel. I have to clean them often, but this knife, it's not steel. Even after all this use, not a bit of corrosion. Look how nice it looks. No corrosion. Nothing at all. And I haven't even taken it to the coast yet, but I will. I can't think of a better knife, though, for coastal living or to keep on a boat, especially a fixed blade made of this material. I would love that. I'm struggling a bit with sharpening this knife. I know the process is slightly different, but I'm working on figuring out the best way to do that for me, and I'll report back. I know what I'm supposed to do, but getting it right is another matter. After years of sharpening steel, this is a different animal, like a gazelle or a pangolin. So, okay. So what are the downsides? Who is this blade for, and under what circumstances? Oh, well, I'm glad you asked, Internet. First, the downsides. This is a work knife, and a work knife only. Terravantium is really only good for real knife tasks. If you need a blade to be razor sharp and do super fine detail work, this is not the right material. And it's not the right material if you're planning to carry one knife for both defense and work. This just won't be sharp enough. Even at its sharpest, I don't think you can get Terravantium sharp enough to use defensively. Yeah, I mean, it's going to work, and it would suck to get slashed with super sharp Terravantium, but I don't think it would be as effective as very, very sharp steel. Part of that is, of course, technique. What are you going to saw your attacker to death? You'd be there for a really long time sawing. When the knife got to that working edge, one time I was cutting something and my hand slipped. The knife didn't even break the skin. A steel blade would have cut me quite badly, but you have to have that technique down to cut with this effectively. Terravantium just isn't what I would choose for defense. I don't think it would work well at all. I'm also not sure that this knife is for a casual knife person, someone who uses a knife to open the mail. This material is really expensive, and the knives that use it are expensive. Casual folks who cut open the mail or a package every now and then, they should get something simpler and cheaper, frankly. But if you use a knife every day for work, I would struggle to think of something better. Certainly for my own circumstances, it would be tough to beat this. I'm going to carry this as my primary work folder for a long time to come. Also, if you own a boat or work near the coast or you sweat in a humid environment, this might be just the ticket. I don't think you can go wrong in those cases. I've also been thinking, how cool would it be to have a kitchen knife made out of Terravantium? No corrosion and a working edge that will last a very long time. That sounds outstanding. Final thoughts. The P38 has very much impressed me. It's my favorite work folder at the moment. But more than that, Terravantium has impressed me. Looking at the P38, there's not much to mess up here. Look at it. The design is outstanding. You can't go wrong with that. But Terravantium, that was a complete unknown to me, and I knew it was going to take a while to separate the hype and the irrational loathing. But I found a material that is fantastic for certain jobs and not great for others. For work, it's one of the best materials available, maybe the best. I don't know yet. Only time and more testing will tell. More work needs to be done both by the knife community and makers before we can say, but it's certainly near the top of a short list. I love it and I love using it. Whenever a tool comes along that makes life easier, that's worth something to me. But you also have to be aware of the limits. Terravantium is not the answer for a defensive knife. It's too expensive for casual users unless you happen to live on a boat. In that case, it's still worthy of consideration. And it's tricky when the manufacturer sends you a product. Even if we say that doesn't cloud our judgment, it does. How can you not feel warm fuzzies about someone who's given you some free shit? That combined with the hype made this a tough one. If you're a knife fan and you use your knives often, you need to take a look at Terrain 365. And I have a feeling this one will still frequently find its way into my pocket for the next little bit. Probably a lot longer than the next little bit. I may even send it back to the factory to have it resharpened and give it a freshening up. I'll let you know how that goes because I kind of want to test this whole process again. I think that would be really fun. But I love this knife. For a work knife, Terravantium is killer. Check it out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Good night.